The most common complaint I hear about healing is that healers have too much responsibility. And from newer players, the common complaint is often the intimidation factor. And when you see polls like this for the first time, I get it. What are we responsible for here? And how do we even begin to read all of this? My name is Bowser. Let's bolster the healers. To make odds and ends of all of these cast bars, I think it's first important to go over what we're responsible for and not responsible for as healers. And to start us off, things we're not responsible for: the tank. The tank's gameplay loop is to take care of their own health bar, manage their defensives, and keep threat of enemies. Tanks should be pretty much always pulling based on what they have up and what they can possibly handle. Now, every tank is different, so they'll have different cooldowns and different healing needs. I have an entire video on that if you want to go watch it. That being said, they don't require much healing, and even the tanks that do need more healing than normal, such as Brewmasters, are typically speaking still fine for long periods of time. If your tank is consistently and constantly requiring you to heal them all the time, there's a pretty good chance that they're not doing their job right, and maybe they're missing a part of their kit. One of the best examples of this is I'll get paladins that don't stand in their consecration very often, and they're often taking a significantly larger portion of damage because they're not utilizing their mastery. The other thing we're really not responsible for is avoidable damage. Now, we are responsible for not getting hit, and we're also responsible for healing people up if they survive. However, avoidable damage is a DPS, tank, and healer responsibility on a personal level. So, speaking of the tank will receive moves such as frontals, cones, cleaves, and thrusts that target them specifically. Essentially, you always want to be on the butt of a mob, and the mob wants to be facing the tank. You don't typically want to be standing next to the tank, unless of course it's better for positioning. In Uldaman, Legacy of Tyr, the final boss is a Mistweaver. I typically stand right next to the tank. However, there is a frontal cone. I need to dodge every once in a while, but ultimately if I want more uptime, I need to stand there. But there are many pulls where there are cleaves and whatnot, and I do not need to be standing next to the tank, and you shouldn't be. So you might need to tell the DPS here and again, hey, watch out for the frontal, but if they end up dying to a frontal, well, it's not your fault. It's also not your fault if they die to a swirly. Ground effects such as swirlies, lines, puddles, you name it. These are things that are, again, personal responsibility and players shouldn't be getting hit with. If somebody gets one shot, that's not your fault. And if somebody gets almost one shot and then dies while you're trying to heal someone else, right, it's not really your responsibility. If you can heal them, 100% you want to heal them, because that's one less death, that's one player still up, and that is good for the dungeon run. But again, just because other people are making mistakes doesn't mean the healer made a mistake. So let's talk about unavoidable damage and responsibility. We're a lot more responsible for this damage, although it is important to note some unavoidable damage is in fact avoidable. Maybe you can line of sight it, maybe you can crowd control or interrupt it, but at the end of the day, these are the moves that we're the most responsible for. And to start us off, gigantic AoE. Gigantic AoE are moves such as Shattering Bellow or Halls of Infusion's last boss that does a big hit at the start of every round of combat, or even just the ticking damage of Vortex Pinnacle's second boss. This is something that you can't really stop and you have to deal with. Plan your heals around this. The majority of your cooldowns or combos or ramping work in these places, and good news, they're pretty much static instances. This damage will always come out, it'll always happen, and you should always be prepared for it. So keep an eye out for those moves, know your boss fights, and as you learn the fights, you'll start to get to know where your buttons go here. Fixations are an odd one. This is when a mob decides that it's a particular player's day to die, and these moves hit quite hard, or they're just the mob auto-attacking that player relentlessly. In the case of a mob auto-attacking a player relentlessly as if that player had threat, you're going to want to use crowd control, external defensives, and heal the player who's getting hit. It's also the responsibility of the player getting hit to probably pop a defensive and not have their back turned to the mob, because if your back is turned to an auto-attack, you'll take more damage. This is also maybe a group responsibility, if you will, because if everyone turns to deal with the fixated mob in this scenario, we're more likely to get through it with less incoming damage, especially if more players are using more crowd control. In the case that it's a move such as Vicious Claw Mangle or Blind Rage, these moves can be stopped with crowd control, but they're also particularly more deadly when they hit a target. Very important to keep an eye out for the players targeted by those and either heal them accordingly or help crowd control the mob so that they don't get attacked. Targeted spells and abilities is the hardest part. It's why there's all these cast bars and how to parse all of this. First of all, it's not all our responsibility, and second of all, we will go over what part is our responsibility to kind of ease the burden of all of these moves. Before we get all into cast bars, Bowser the editor here, I just want to make note, you do one add-on such as Plater that will allow you to see who a move is being cast on. As far as I can tell from the default UI, it's not very easy to figure out who a move is being targeted on. So grab something like Plater, and if you go to my old interface video, you'll be able to pull my Plater profile, which has a good basic setup for this. So as you're learning dungeons, classify these moves into 3 kinds. Some targeted spells and abilities are rot damage, just small incoming amounts of damage that are pretty consistent. Busters, which I like to use as a term synonymous with tank busters, for the harder hitting moves. A good example of these two are bolt spells in Brackenhide Hollow and Withering Burst. The bolt spells hurt, especially on high level keys, but they don't typically take out a player in one cast unless something very, very bad has happened. It's also good with the rot damage to take note of how much damage players are taking per hit. If a spell goes off and it does a quarter of someone's health bar, that means it can take about 3 of them before it's lethal. This is really good for understanding how soon someone might be dying to a move, and tell you who's your priority target to heal. If, say, somebody's about to get hit with a Buster spell and you know they can survive it at full health, you might want to full heal that player so that they don't die to it, rather than the person who's only lost a quarter of their life to a rot spell. Now, some busters do hit hard enough that they'll just kill you, and depending on your key level, they'll start killing you pretty early, Withering Burst being particularly horrifying in this regard. You can also just stop these moves. Use your crowd control and interrupts to stop moves from going off. It's the best defensive. If the move doesn't hit the target, they don't take any damage. And as funny as that is, it's really beneficial to spend 1 GCD saving someone's life than maybe having to commit a large cooldown or a big external to save someone's life. However, using an external isn't a bad idea if it'll keep someone alive and you have no crowd control available. But some of these moves cannot be stopped, in which case you do need to use an external or heal these players, so it's good to know where to use your crowd control, where to use your interrupts, and where to use externals and just straight up healing. My final category of targeted spells are must stops. These are things such as Hideous Cackle or Shadow Bolt Volley, Withering Curse. These moves will have a terrible impact on your team if you let them go off, but a lot of players are typically holding their crowd control for these, so to make sure you don't waste yours when you might want to hold yours for saving someone's life, it's good to have an interrupt tracker or something along those lines so that you can know what players have left in their kit in order to stop moves from going off, so that you can tell, oh, do I need to spend my interrupt on this Hideous Cackle, or does maybe the tank have it? But that requires you putting some trust in your teammates, and that brings us back to responsibility. This is a lot of information, but you're not supposed to handle it all on your own. Players should be aware of when they're taking lots of damage or when they're low on health, and when they potentially need to use a defensive or reflect or simply heal themselves up to full before getting hit. It's not always possible for a DPS to do that, which is why you're there as a healer. But let's imagine we went into this Brackenhide Hollow that we're referring to this whole time, and no one but the healer uses crowd control or interrupts. The party could very much just die from incoming damage, even on a low key like a 5, just because that is so much more damage that the healer has to deal with, and there's nothing else stopping it. That's unfair. Don't let players walk over you for it. I like using details for the death log so that I can check to see what people died to. That'll let me know if I made a mistake or if it was something that they could have stopped themselves. Responsibility is hard here. You want to be responsible for heals that, again, are your responsibility, and if you can clutch up, you want to be able to clutch up and heal people, but try not to be too hard on yourself because other people made mistakes. I've had tanks yell at me for not healing them when I had to do party-wide healing. There is no scenario where I can heal the tank to full and do party-wide healing during a massive AoE mechanic such as Tantrum in Underrot. Play it cool, don't be rude, but don't let players walk on you for that, because I will be making a video about it. The DPS and the tanks of this world aren't always thinking about incoming damage and what it'll do to them, and if all that responsibility does lay on the healer, it's too much, and that's often what leads to that intimidating or I feel like I'm responsible for the whole dungeon feeling. That being said, that does bring us to the end of this episode of Bolster the Healers. If you like this series, get subscribed. There's going to be more coming. That DPS video you can send to your friend will probably be next, and of course, if you like healing content, there's plenty more of that on this channel that won't be Bolster the Healers, so check it all out. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.